entire previous debt of the country in less than 2 terms. I mean, all of the math was right on the money. And the way, as I explained in this high school, this pair of rhetorical questions to this teacher, the way that this obfuscation of the currency multiplies debt into terminal indebtedness is that it forces us to maintain a vital circulation, out of which circulation, which at most is comprised of some remaining principal, we're constantly paying all the remainder of owed principal, plus whatever interest. And so we're constantly borrowing principal back into circulation as new debt equal to the old, and interest back into circulation as further debt above the former sum of debt. So as the sum of debt increases, any rate of interest predicates an ever greater sum of periodic interest on debt, thus inherently multiplying the sum of artificial indebtedness in proportion to the circulation at an ever escalating rate. So in the end of the life cycle of any such system, we reach failure at a very escalated rate. We're beyond failure now, and we're in a period of what I have called artificial sustention. All the things that are being done now, I actually provided to the Reagan administration, not as suggestions, but to argue that each of these things that they're doing, federal overspending, for instance, have themselves limited lifespans, so that the system, we can still understand that the system is inevitably terminal. And of course, my work was proven out also by the computer models that I provided the Reagan administration about 1982. They called me out of the blue. I thought I wasn't going to hear from them any longer, and they asked me if it was possible to project this inevitable failure, and I said indeed it is, and I explained exactly how you would do so, and the next thing you know, I was writing computer models for the Reagan administration at my own cost for 6 months, and then we ran literally thousands of scenarios for interest rates. They didn't even, I asked them, well, you have to tell me what kind of interest rates you're going to charge, and they didn't even know. They maintained that they had to maintain elevated interest rates, and I said, no. As the sum of debt reaches a terminal volume, a given interest rate, your only means of extending the lifespan further is to reduce the effective rates of interest, and continue to extend the lifespan by continual reductions of interest until even zero rates, prime rates, that is rates of interest that the Federal Reserve charges to member banks, aren't sufficient to prevent further multiplication into a terminal state, because there are outstanding rates of interest that are binding upon existing debt. Otherwise, of course, all debts would eventually revert to non-interest bearing debts in the end of a lifespan. So if I may, then I'll read this parable of perfect economy, which applies to the colonial era. Amongst the injustices leading to the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin was sent to England in part to demand the relaxation of taxes. While the colonists' prosperity fell under the recent injustices, they had already become prominent manufacturers and traders. They were skillful and innovative shipbuilders, and now the vessels they had built even enabled them to become equally skillful evaders of the many excessive duties levied upon them without the familiar requisite they were about to demand: representation. Presently they rose, perhaps as no colony had before, to demand a return toward justice. Franklin was a renowned author, publisher, scientist, philosopher, and statesman, and there was tremendous anticipation of his arrival in the mother country. The subjects of each environment grew in opposite directions. The colonists expected independence. Their English cousins and their ruling class expected subjugation. In England, the little news from the colonies was passed largely by disreputable sailors in equally disreputable places. Little was believed of these tales, and so it was largely assumed that Franklin's reputation was exaggerated. It was anticipated that his visit would prove him relatively uncultured, a woodsman hardly fit to duly represent his peers amongst English dignitaries. The encounter, however, would soon prove him far ahead of their time. His answers to their questions would change the world. Upon his arrival, Franklin was swept to a prominent engagement. There, before the ruling class of England, the guest of honor was soon compelled to make a speech. Amidst considerable ado, Franklin walked slowly to the podium, adjusted the curious spectacles the woodsman had invented, and surveyed his audience attentively. Thinking undecidedly what to speak about, instead he thought it better to ask them, "What's your pleasure?" They, of course, beseeched him to tell about the colonies. He knew well of their affairs, and particularly that even prominent lawyers spent a good part of the year behind on their rent, that they often went hungry, that few non-aristocrats owned property, that many suffered from poor diet, that common citizens spent their lives hoping to pay imposing debt. The British people were largely ever hopeful of meaningful employment and in constant dire need. He was naturally inclined, therefore, to convey the relative state of the colonies, and so he began his answer with what, in retrospect, is readily understood to be a remarkable report. He began saying, "You can leave your ship with just your baggage, walk beyond the furthest homestead, and become an immediate landowner." Such disbelief arose upon his first sentence that Franklin was forced to stop. England's upper class loudly refused to believe him. Franklin nonetheless simply waited for quiet, and when he could, he continued without responding otherwise to the interruption. He thus spoke slowly, and perhaps even somewhat defiantly, saying, "Furthermore, the forests are vast, and you can cut down all the trees you can imagine and build whatever kind of home you please. The soil is rich and fertile, and you can clear all the land you want and plant practically any crop you desire, and it will grow with vitality. Unspoiled streams are everywhere. The water is pure and good, and may be diverted to irrigate your fields. The wilderness is so rich in game that there is no possible shortage of meat. The people are happy and busy and prosperous." No sooner did he finish his brief, continued answer than outright disclaim once again erupted. A particularly angry man stood to take charge, shouting above the rest, "How can you possibly account for prosperity in the colonies?" The audience so celebrated this denunciation that again for some while it was impossible to speak. Franklin patiently blinked back at them, disbelieving himself they could prescribe such unreasonable limits to the truth. When they finally quieted, he told them exactly how he could account for prosperity in the colonies. "It's quite simple," he said. "We have created our own currency." Again, a great uproar erupted. Who were the colonists to create their own currency? How could a currency possibly account for prosperity? The former is no longer understood to be a right and responsibility, and the latter is doubted in this very style even today. Franklin explained that If, for instance, a man raises fowl, and here I'm explaining the nature of a promissory obligation, so this is the part of the story that you need to pay attention to for further discussion here. Franklin explained that, quote, if, for instance, a man raises fowl and a second raises feed, and the first intends in the next season to double his production, he may approach the second, wanting him to produce the additional feed required. They agree how much of the production of each will be traded to the other, and their eventual contracts are evidence of their promises to deliver to each other. In other words, promissory obligations. Franklin continues in the story then. Their notes may then be circulated as currency, just as we have today, in other words. He goes on in this story, saying, the cultivator of the feed, for instance, may write a note against the fowl to be delivered to him to pay for a doctor to take care of his family. The doctor may pay for goods with the same note at the local store. The store then will ultimately collect the fowl originally promised to the cultivator. When the production is delivered, the respective notes are fulfilled and the money passes from circulation. This is very important to understand. Fulfilled promissory obligations are the property of no one. They are retired from circulation. As fulfilled IOUs, they no longer represent an obligation to deliver anything or, therefore, value. He goes on in this story then saying, without even a need for administration, the circulation is perpetually regulated according to need. There is no inflation or deflation because the circulation always arises and passes with the life and consumption of the production. So this, of course, is a principle that we're deploying in this proposition of mathematically perfected economy, which is emulated in the natural life cycle of a promissory obligation. So he goes on to finish this story, this part of the story, then saying, neither therefore do we suffer multiplication of debt by interest. In fact, the very ability of the people to issue their promises to pay itself makes it possible to sustain whatever prosperity we are capable of. End of brief speech. So far had his English cousins deviated from this natural pattern that the rectitude of a populace issuing a just currency was even an affront to them. The very quests of his audience for unearned profit, too, deprived the general population not only. At this point in our live broadcast, unfortunately, we suffer a power outage which disconnects this call, multi-party call, from the coordinator of the broadcast. So we're forced to recover, call each other back. There is no indication from my end when we've lost this connection. So I don't even know where to pick up at this part. So to hopefully recover as gracefully as possible, I back up somewhere in the story and hopefully overlap what I've already said. So that's the reason for this break and the clumsy attempt to pick up at some point, which might suffice to cover, the points of discussion which I'd hope to communicate by reading this parable of perfect economy.
They raced the home Aaron's sister Sarah. A tree across the street was burning. Sarah's house was badly damaged.
Have we lost our connection here?
Yes, we did. Now we're back again.
Okay, boy, do you have any idea where I was when I left off? When we lost?
You were you were talking about the disposition of the obligation when the that someone gave a promissory note and the other person delivered a chicken and for goods that they'd already taken, and